Okay, so a big welcome to tonight's free webinar with Frank Anderson. Frank, you're very welcome.
It's good to be here.
How are you doing? How are you doing?
I'm doing great, actually. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm not crazy about the cold weather because it's certainly turning winter here, but it's the eve of Thanksgiving for those people who are here in the States who know about that. So I'm going to pick up my mom and we're going to have a nice family time. So I'm feeling really good, actually. Relaxed and good.
Okay, thanks, Frank. So tonight's free webinar is a prelude to Frank's webinar series, which is on the 13th to the 15th of January, 2023. And it's called Transcending Trauma, Healing Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder with Internal Family Systems Therapy. And Mary, what you might do, please, you might post a link for anybody that's interested in signing up for that webinar series. And what we'll do, Frank, we'll just go through a few practicalities before we start. So as usual, any tech problems, what we suggest is that you log off, log back on using the link provided. And if the issues persist, what we suggest is that you contact Mary. And Mary's email is mary@pcpsi.ie. And Frank is going to do a presentation on the webinar series and the new book for about 30 or 40 minutes. But what we would love if people have a question or want to interact with Frank, what you can do is to put up your yellow hand, which is under the reactions button, which as I look at the screen is the bottom right-hand side. And all we need you to do when you come on is just turn on your mic and turn on your camera, and you can ask questions or just have a chat with Frank. So for us, it makes the interaction more lively, and so we really encourage that. But again, some people mightn't like that, so feel free to send any questions in through the Q&A function. And just to say that Mary and Robert are in the background, keeping the show on the road as usual. So a big thanks to Mary and a big thanks to Robert. And just to say that Frank is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist specializing in the treatment of trauma and dissociation. He's a lead trainer with the IFS Institute, and he's lectured extensively on the neuroscience of post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociation. And his newest book, I'll just put it up there for anybody that doesn't know it. It's again the same title as the workshop, Transcending Trauma, Healing Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder with Internal Family Systems Therapy. Now, okay, Frank, you can take over when you're ready, and it's really good to see you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Liam. I appreciate it. And it's always lovely to do things like this so that people can get a sense of what we're going to be talking about. And I'm really grateful that you kind of had me be a part of this series, because I know that you've been really successful at spreading the word and getting the message out to people around various different mental health related issues. So for me, I'm excited to talk about this passion of mine, which is healing relational trauma. I would say that's kind of been my specialty for quite a long time. You know, working way back in 1992 with Bessel Kolk, when I first started doing this trauma worked with Bessel Kolk at the trauma center. I was a psychiatrist for the trauma center for a long time. And then was primarily doing prescriptions. And, you know, when you give people medicines who have a trauma history, you have to do it in a different way. There's a certain power differential that shows up, and, you know, giving people a pill to put in their mouth doesn't work so well with trauma survivors, and you have to really learn how to navigate, negotiate differently. So I was really lucky to be able to do psychotherapy as a psychiatrist with people with trauma histories, because it wasn't going to be take this pill, here's this prescription, I'll see you in a month. It just didn't work that way. So I was lucky to start doing psychotherapy in addition to medications with people who have trauma histories. And so Bessel would always have me do workshops for him at his annual trauma conference. He always has annual trauma conferences. And one year, I think it was probably 2004, he invited this guy, Dick Schwartz, to do a workshop also. Bessel always picks, the biggest and the brightest in the field and brings them together in this way for his annual trauma conference, which is wonderful. And so I met Dick Schwartz, 2004, went to his workshop, and I was kind of a game changer for me, honestly. It was like, wow, there is something really different here. I was very intrigued. I'd been doing work with clients with trauma histories. I'd worked with a lot of severe trauma, people who have DID or dissociative identity disorder, PTSD, acute trauma, right? But there was something for me really different about IFS. So when I met Dick Schwartz and I heard that workshop, who is the founder, I thought, wow, I got to dive in. So I just took level 1 training, took level 2 training, took level 3 training. I'm one of these people that fast and furious needed to learn everything about IFS that I possibly could. And Dick and I became friends pretty quickly, which was lovely. Now I have to say, fast forward all these years later, you can't even get into a level 1 training if you wanted to. It's so popular, it's widespread throughout the world, and there's a waiting list. I don't know, maybe 10,000 people are on the waiting list to get into one of these level 1 trainings. So it's very popular and it's very hard to get into. Reason being is because it touches people. It has an effect on people in a way that I think other psychotherapy modalities don't. And I'm not going to say it's the best one or it's the only one, because I don't believe that. I have a very integrative approach to the treatment of trauma, but there's some things that IFS offers that are different and unique compared to other models of therapy. And so that's part of what I'm excited to share with people during this upcoming webinar. I'm somebody who did EMDR training. I was one of the first people trained in EMDR, interestingly enough, because Bessel got a hold of it and he brought it to the trauma center way back in 1992. And we did a study comparing EMDR and Prozac, right? I was a psychiatrist who gave everybody Prozac, and there were therapists in the clinic who gave everybody EMDR. And that kind of seminal study showed that EMDR was more effective than Prozac for PTSD, which was a big deal back then. So I've trained in EMDR. I also trained with Pat Ogden and Janina Fisher, who I know many of you know through workshops here, in sensory motor psychotherapy. So I was also, then secondly, I trained in sensory motor psychotherapy and really learned how to work with trauma in the body in a way that's been super helpful in my career. And then so many years later, meeting Dick Schwartz, for me, I just kind of put it all together. There's a way of, different people need different things at different times. This is the way I see it with trauma. And so it's good to have a lot of tools in your toolbox. And hopefully, for those of you who don't know that much about IFS, this workshop will help you learn enough of IFS to maybe start incorporating it into your practice. Internal family systems is one of those very easy to understand models, but not so easy to be effective at it, right? It's like, oh, I can understand everybody has parts. We all have different aspects of our personality. And there's certain types of parts, right? There are parts that protect, and there are parts that carry wounds, pain, or trauma. And the protective parts come in 2 different varieties, right? There's parts that protect preventatively, right? They're working really hard to do the right thing, to please people, to caretake, so that everything goes smoothly, so that everybody likes me, so that no problems ensue. We call those managers. And then there are protective parts that will protect more extremely or more reactively. For example, suicide, or cutting, or binging, or dissociation are more extreme protective parts that show up, interestingly enough, Liam, they show up only when the wound has been triggered. So it's an important thing to know from the IFS perspective that when those extreme symptoms show up, they're showing up for a reason. It's not random, because what ends up happening is most people, most therapists get triggered, activated, or very controlling or overwhelmed when those extreme symptoms show up. They'll call people a borderline, or they'll, speak in a disparaging way towards them, because these extreme symptoms are very hard to work with for people. That's one of the reasons trauma workshops are so popular amongst therapists, because when you're working with these extreme symptoms, it's very challenging. They're not collaborative. They're not cooperative. They have one thing and one thing in mind, and that's to stop the pain inside. They don't care about the therapist. They don't care about being polite. They want to stop the pain no matter what. So when we hold that perspective about these different parts that protect from an extreme nature, parts that protect preventatively, we understand that they're serving a larger purpose inside. They're serving keeping the pain away. And what I will say in trauma, particularly, especially relational trauma, you have people in relational trauma, it's typically repetitive and ongoing. So it's not like you get yelled at once, or your dad's drunk and beats you once. It's ongoing and repetitive. So there's this cumulative nature in complex trauma or relational trauma, which makes it very challenging to work with. It's not easy when you're talking about someone who's been repeatedly bullied in the school system, or someone who's been in abusive relationships over and over and over again, starting way back in childhood. So it's important to hold the framework of the different parts as we're working with people who have complex trauma histories, because those are the ones that really, I think, give most therapists the most challenge, honestly. And another thing that I'll say about internal family systems, which was really wonderful for me, is this concept and idea that everyone has self-energy. Everyone has this thing inside of them called self-energy. That's the term that internal family systems uses. Different therapies use different terminology. Janina talks about wise mind, for example. DBT talks about being mindful. IFS has this term of self-energy, which says that every single person has inherent wisdom. Every single person has healing capacity within them. It doesn't need to be cultivated. It doesn't need to be built up, which is a novel idea for some trauma therapists, because often in trauma therapy, we're thinking our clients are defective, they have too many symptoms, and we need to build up their capacity to tolerate the trauma healing. IFS does not hold that viewpoint. We say everybody has in them what they need to heal. Let me help you access it. It's a matter of accessing more than it's a matter of deficiency within us. So that's an important concept. Now, as we do go through the workshop, I'm going to be kind of overview of the model. So for those people out there who maybe have gone to a workshop, maybe heard about it, maybe have read one of the books that I've written, they're interested, but they're having trouble incorporating it into their practice, we're going to really go through the model. So I'm going to try to teach people what we call the 6 F's of working with protective parts. Like, how actually do you work with these protective parts when you're in psychotherapy? There are steps involved in that. What is the goal of working with protective parts? In the IFS perspective, the goal of working with protective parts is to get permission, to get their permission to go to the vulnerability, to heal the wounds underneath, because we don't move forward unless we have permission. And that's a big difference, because a lot of therapies will kind of move forward without really getting permission from the internal system. So we're very careful to move forward only with permission, right? So I'll be teaching you how to do that in this workshop. We're also I want to say one other thing about parts that I think is really important for people to kind of hold is this concept that every part has a positive intention. Because most therapists, excuse me for saying it, get pissed off at clients and their symptoms. They get pissed off at them because they're doing things in a way that on the surface looks negative or problematic or unhealthy. All of these words people tend to use. But what we understand in internal family systems is that every single part has a positive intention. Every single part has a positive intention. And that is also kind of a game changer for a lot of therapists. What do you mean drinking has a positive intention? What do you mean cutting has a positive intention? Suicide's horrible. Why would we say that's positive? The reality is that we always look at the intention of the part, not the effect it has. And that's a big distinction, intention from effect. We never focus on the effect the part has. It's typically negative, and they typically know it. They typically know it. So every time you would point out a negative intention of a behavior, the part feels shamed. So you inject shame when you say drinking's bad, or don't hit your children, that's unhealthy. So every time you point out something negative, these parts experience it in a shaming nature. So we're always looking at the IFS perspective, the positive intention of these symptoms or parts, not the negative intention. And that's challenging for some therapists, especially if you, for example, as a therapist, have a partner, a son, a daughter, or a family member who's an alcoholic and who's kind of wreaking havoc in your life. It's hard for you to have a positive intention with your client who's struggling with alcoholism, right? So we're also looking at therapist parts, like what in the therapist gets activated or triggered by clients that make it hard for the therapist to hold a compassionate stance, right? We always are looking at therapist parts. So we'll do some work in the workshop, some experiences, some exercises to explore some of the therapist parts, like what parts of you, Liam, might get triggered or activated if you're working with somebody who's really angry, for example, or what parts of you get triggered or activated when you're working with somebody who's shut down and depressed and really withdrawn. We're always examining the parts of the therapist because they get in the way of the therapist being open and loving. It's hard for the therapist to be open and receptive when their own parts are getting activated and triggered. So we'll look at that a little bit. So you can, a lot of therapies call that countertransference. IFS calls it therapist parts. So we'll explore some of that. We're also going to look at the neurobiology of PTSD and dissociation. As a psychiatrist and somebody who really is interested in neuroscience, I think it's more than interesting. I think neuroscience can really inform therapeutic decision-making, particularly as it relates to internal family systems. So a lot of what I've written in Transcending Trauma, which is really kind of accumulation of my life's work, is to be able to look at the ways, parallel internal family systems model of therapy with neuroscience. So I apply a lot of neuroscience knowledge and neuroscience principles as they relate to the internal family systems model. So we'll be looking at certain things, and it grounds the model in science. We've done research studies on IFS and complex trauma. I was second author on a study there, just really showing the effectiveness. So we'll spend some time looking at the neuroscience of empathy and of compassion, the neuroscience of PTSD and dissociation, and then showing you from the IFS perspective how neuroscience informs different kinds of therapeutic decisions. So we'll be spending time certainly talking about that. We'll talk about attachment trauma and pre-verbal trauma. This is something that I love dealing with and is much more common than people are aware of, especially when they're working with complex PTSD, is those early young attachment wounds. Those early young attachment wounds drive most adults' relational decisions, and they're unaware of it. So our wounds in childhood, whether they're wounds with the primary parent or mother or father, are what really drives it really drives our adult relationship decisions, but they activate our young attachment needs. So we're going to be looking at attachment trauma. We're going to be looking at the different attachment styles and how that correlates or not, interestingly enough, with internal family systems. And then how we navigate and work with attachment wounds and or pre-verbal trauma. You know, recently, or not recently, currently, I should say, I'm working with a client who has all of these physical problems, all of these medical problems. He's one of these lifers in the medical systems, going from one doctor to the next, one doctor to the next. And nobody's ever been able to help him connect to the fact that he was actually hit by his abusive father while he was in utero with his mother. And he never made the connection because he had no language and he had no conscious memory that a lot of his physical problems in current day life are related to being hit in the womb. That little infant, that little baby absorbed a lot of trauma by the mother being hit in the belly. And that had huge impact on my client and a lot of his medical problems. So we've been doing some pre-verbal work to look at how you can access traumatic memory that doesn't include words. Because we know implicit memory is present at birth, but explicit memory, where we have language attached, doesn't come online until 2 years of age. So any kids who are traumatized before 2 years of age only hold implicit memory and they don't have explicit memory. So we'll be talking a little bit about attachment trauma. We'll also talk about shame cycles. Like, shame is such a huge piece as it relates to complex and relational trauma. You're looking at shame cycles that are what I call hyper aroused or come from critical or verbally abusive protective parts in the perpetrator. But we're also going to be looking at shame cycles as they relate to neglect and avoidance and the lack of love. So those are two common shame cycles. So we'll map those out a little bit and take and explore how we, from the IFS perspective, may be dealing with some shame wounds that are connected to neglect or to physical verbal abuse. So that's something that I think we'll spend some time talking about. I'm hoping that we're going to be able, depending on how many people we have, we might be able to do some experiential exercises too, right? So that people can go into breakout rooms and try some of this stuff, try working with protective parts, try feeling into the differences between empathy and compassion. Because what I'll say to people is, even though IFS is an easy model to understand, putting it in practice is hard. And if you do it, at least during the workshop, you're going to be much better off trying to incorporate it into your private practice offices or in your clinics or wherever you might be working. People notice, like, when they practice on the first day, then practice again on the second day, they're shocked with how quickly you can incorporate some of these IFS principles when you practice it. So I really do encourage people to do the practices. It's okay to be bad when you're in a workshop, right? Be bad with your colleagues so you can be less bad when you're sitting with your patients and they're in your offices. So we'll be talking about that also, how to do that work, and how to do some practice. The other thing we're going to be talking about, and this is kind of becoming more and more relevant in our lives, is looking at cultural, society, and familial trauma. There's so much trauma that's in our culture and society. There's so much trauma to get passed down through generations of families. There's so much trauma based on who you are, what the color of your skin is, where you grew up, what ethnicity you come from. And those kinds of traumas really have a big impact on people with relational or complex PTSD also. So we're going to be looking at what IFS calls legacy burdens and how we deal with them. And interestingly enough, how we can release them, because legacy burdens can also be released. And people are surprised to hear that. But the way I think about it, Liam, is this: we shouldn't have to carry anything that doesn't belong to us. And we absorb so much stuff as we live our lives. We absorb stuff from culture, stuff from the television, stuff from interactions that we have with people. And they're not ours, but they stay within our system and it becomes problematic. So we're going to talk about how we address and release legacy burdens so people feel freed up to heal some of the deeper stuff, because often legacy burdens will get in the way of healing relational or complex PTSD. And I will talk about the healing process in IFS. I mentioned earlier, there is the steps of working with protective parts, but I'm also going to talk about how we do the healing phases in IFS. So there's two different phases to the model. One is working with protective parts to get their permission. The second is working with the wounded parts, the vulnerability, and show how healing is possible. I'm a big fan of healing. That's something that I will say it's kind of a mission for me. I really have this global mission of healing trauma throughout the world. And I think there's too many people and too many psychotherapy modalities that are a bit on the bypass front. Okay, let's move forward. Let's get over it. Let's get beyond it. Okay, and I feel like the way to get over something or beyond it is through it. And I really feel like it's important to be with these experiences, not push them away, to send them loving compassion for the ways they've been trying to help us and try to protect us, and to give these parts of us corrective experiences. Healing, from my perspective, occurs in three different dimensions: witnessing or sharing the story or experience. Number two, having a corrective experience, disconfirming something loving instead of violating, and then releasing what we no longer need to carry. So I see these three steps that are very important in healing. And, you know, it's kind of surprising to me, but there's a lot of psychotherapy modalities that don't even include healing, you know, that don't even get to the core issue. And I think it's very important. Another thing that we'll be discussing, and this is relatively new for me, so I haven't written that much about it in my book, Transcending Trauma, but I think about it more and more these days, is this term called post-traumatic growth. And I think it's an important term. I think it needs to be tweaked a little bit. I think it would be post-healing growth, because I don't want people to grow beyond the trauma without doing the healing work. So I think we need to do the healing work, but I have this growing awareness that therapists spend a lot of time on the past. Therapists focus on the history, and it can take a long time to help somebody overcome trauma. I also think there's a lot of coaches that might focus too much on the present, on the future. Like, let's move forward, let's change, let's move forward, at the expense of getting to the core issue. So I feel there's this balance. I feel there's this really important balance, going back, looking at the origins of something, helping to release and let go of what no longer serves you, and then move forward in a way that's important around change. Because, you know, you just don't heal a wound and then simultaneously people skip off into the sunset and everything is fine. That's really not what happened. I think we need to be more deliberate as therapists. I think we need to be more deliberate as therapists around helping people make those changes. They don't often come like they come in a Hollywood movie, the big aha moment, and then you skip off into the sunset. They come in these little collective cumulative changes, and then people all of a sudden think, wow, I'm different in this relationship, or I can be intimate in a way that I've never been able to before, or I stand up to people. This is what I'm experiencing now in my life, honestly, personally, is I've done a huge piece of work on my own personal trauma, and I can speak up now in a way that I've never been able to before. I had a call recently with somebody who wanted me to contribute to her book. And I was almost kind of an afterthought. And in the past, I would have been just accommodating and pleasant and sure, I'll do whatever. And I didn't this time. I said, I have to say something. This feels kind of uncomfortable for me. Like, I kind of feel like I'm an afterthought here. Could you please explain why you're reaching out to me so late in the process of you writing your book? And I was like looking at myself like, wow, Frank, look at you. You're speaking up in a way that you wouldn't have done that before, right? That was really a shift in me. Instead of being dominated by my nice and kind parts, I was able to kind of show up in a very different way. And I know that's a direct result of the healing work that I've done. So we're going to be talking about the different components and the different elements of healing and how we can help people kind of move beyond kind of staying stuck in their trauma or staying too rooted in their history or processing for years and years and years without really making change. So it's something that's kind of important for me. And I'm really happy to be able to be discussing this and sharing it with you all during the webinar. One other thing I want to talk about maybe, and then I don't know if it makes sense to open up to some questions, but I want to mention one other concept here, Liam, and then I'll open it up for questions. The issue of forgiveness is also coming up for me a lot in my life lately. I think forgiveness is a resilience and forgiveness, I'll say. Resilience and forgiveness are two pieces that are important from my perspective. Why do some people get beaten and brutalized and become like mega millionaires and presidents of the United States, or, owning huge companies? And why do some people who have the same exact trauma end up being on Skid Row, homeless, without any resources and no family? And even with the same trauma, right? So I look at this resilience issue. What are the factors that make someone resilient? What are the qualities that we either need or acquire, develop, in order to be able to overcome or withstand overwhelming life experience? I'm one of those resilient people. Like, I had a pretty significant trauma history. I've done really well. Now, I've worked my butt off in therapy for a large portion of my life, but I have something in me that has made me choose hard work and success over drugs and abusive relationships, right? So there is something that happens in people, and we'll be exploring that during the webinar. And then this issue of forgiveness, like, I think this world is ailing. I think there's a lot of pain and hurt and trauma in the world. Whether your race, your gender, you're in a war, there's just in a pandemic, it's just been so much for so many of us. And once we've done our healing work, whether it's with an individual, whether it's with a country, whether it's with a family or an institution, how do you truly get beyond it? How do you truly let go? Because forgiveness for me is a very empowering issue that is about the person doing the forgiving. It's not about the person we're forgiving, right? And so to really break down forgiveness and see what the elements of it are and what's important in forgiveness, because it's not really about the perpetrator, you giving them the gift of forgiveness. It's really about the person carrying the pain. And, recently, my father passed away like 4 months ago now, and he was a significant perpetrator for me in my life growing up. And it was so powerful for me to be able to give back to him in a loving, kind way after what he had done for me. And he was passed, this wasn't really affecting my dad directly. It was affecting me enormously. Like, I rose above it all, and I was able to give back to him, be kind to him in a way that didn't include the oppression of my trauma. And let me tell you, that was a very powerful experience for me. And I want people to know and to dissect the elements of forgiveness and what is required, what is optional, how one truly gets to a place of forgiveness. A lot of religious institutions or organizations, in my opinion, harp on forgiveness a little bit prematurely. Oh, you're supposed to forgive. Oh, you're supposed to forgive. Okay, how in the heck do I do it? Right? It's easy to say forgive. It's not so easy to do it from your heart. So we'll be talking a little bit about that also. So maybe I'll stop there, Liam, and see if there's any questions that people have, and we can kind of go from there. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's great, Frank. That was super. And there's really a lot of nice comments coming in for you. I'll read some of them out. So from Ben, inspiring ideas. From Mary then, Mary's looking for a clarification. Can you repeat healing 3 parts again, please?
Yeah, so certainly, yeah. So, and during the workshop, I'm going to go through the steps of what IFS calls the unburdening process. Okay, there's steps of unburdening. Just like I said, there are 6 steps of working with protective parts, which we'll talk about. There's also, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 steps of the unburdening process, which is the healing process in IFS. For me, in general, there are 3 key components to healing, regardless of what modality you're using, okay? The first is witnessing or sharing the story. A part that holds the trauma needs to share the story. It can be internally, or it can be with a therapist, or it can be with a partner in your life. Sharing not only the story, Liam, thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations. So sharing the experience. Second phase is you need a disconfirming experience. You need a corrective experience where the part feels loved and seen and heard instead of criticized, alone, and rejected. Okay, there's a corrective experience, and that can happen in many different ways. So that's, for me, the second element that's necessary for trauma healing. One is witnessing or sharing the story. Second is having a corrective experience in some way. And once those 2 elements have occurred, then there is this capacity to transform and release what we're carrying, release all the thoughts, the feelings, and the physical sensations that go along with this experience. So those are the 3 things.
Okay, thanks, Frank. And
yeah,
we have somebody that's looking to come on live, so we'll bring somebody on live just to...
Beautiful. Yeah, beautiful.
So Robert, could we bring on, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Jamina, please?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Thank
Jamina?
you.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a short question. Maybe I should have written it. I just wanted to know if there are going to be also demos. Demos?
Oh, yes, if they're going to be demos. Well, I love doing demos. So I love doing demos, and there certainly will be demos. But here's the one problem. I need volunteers from the audience. So
Oh, I'm sure there will be.
okay, if people are willing to volunteer, yeah, I will do a demo. I would probably do a demo
great.
almost every day, you know,
Great.
because people
Thank
really
you.
like seeing the work be done. So I'm definitely open to doing demos, definitely. Yeah. And people get some free work done if they're interested in doing a demo. So yes, there definitely will be demos. Thank you for asking.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and I think, Robert, could we bring on Mark, please?
Hello, Mark.
Hello, you can hear me.
Yep.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I've been doing a year with Bonnie Badenoch this year, and I was just wondering about taking on more. I'm a third year. I'm doing a part-time degree in counselling, and I suppose my question is, I've been very energized by your presentation. I'd love to do the course. I suppose I'm needing reassurance about taking this on in a few months' time. In terms of, I've only started seeing clients in June, but I see there's so much potential of richness in your work. I'm very interested in trauma myself. Just even relating to the last question, I would be willing to be a guinea pig in a demonstration, because I've seen one clip of Richard Schwartz doing it with Alanis Morissette, and I found it just so powerful and so simple, his suggestions or his guidance. So I suppose the question in there is, yeah, how at my stage, just in my own training, where this would, you know, I guess it would give me a start, but in terms of starting to integrate it already, or would I need more than this, or how would it fit in?
Yeah, interestingly enough, you're better off than 90% of the people by taking it earlier, okay? And here's why. And there's one of the things, because IFS has gotten so popular, like it's in a lot of graduate school programs, and they're teaching it early on, right from the beginning, in a lot of programs, certainly throughout the United States. And I don't know about other parts of the world, but a lot of therapists who have been doing their way of therapy for 20, 30 years have to do a lot of unlearning in order to do IFS, because IFS is kind of in some ways radically different. Okay, you're not talking to people, you're not doing talk therapy. You're having people shift the focus of their attention internally, and they're developing relationships with their parts. Okay, so it's better, like Dick Schwartz will say, it's easier to teach non-therapists about IFS than it is to teach therapists about IFS, for this very reason, because there's a lot of unlearning. So in that case, I'd say yes. Now, your caseload and how much you want to take on, that's up to you, right? But what I will say, and this is pretty typical, is once you do a workshop, you just incorporate stuff, like you just incorporate it pretty quickly. And then what ends up happening, Mark, is that people kind of get stuck, and then like, oh, I don't know what to do. And then they kind of fall back to their old method of working. And then they go to another IFS workshop. And so it's kind of this like one step forward, two steps back, one step forward. But even the idea of incorporating parts work into your psychotherapy is hugely important for people. It's like people can feel it. They like, oh yeah, I get what you're talking about, right? And so you can incorporate it pretty easily. From my perspective, you know, you might not be great at it and go through all the steps, but that's a start.
That's great. Yeah, I because even just with people who I know who've done some training, and it's amazing how quickly I've started to even assume some of the, even that phrase, all parts are welcome. I loved what you said about, you know, regarding negative behavior and not negatively, and as it has meaning, and that really touches me actually. So I love that. I love that whole thing. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I'm signing up.
Okay. Well, we'll see if we can do the demo. I'll see. No promises, but you know, we'll see what we can do. Stack the deck, so to speak.
Okay, Frank, so we'll bring one more person on live and then we can ask a few questions in the Q&A. So
Okay.
Robert, can you bring on Carol, please? Okay, maybe Cal put up her hand by mistake, Frank. So
Okay.
Cal, if you want to come on, you're more than welcome, but we'll just go to the Q&A.
Do you want me to look at those? I can see those.
Do you want to call them out yourself?
Sure.
Okay.
So Ben Stoughton is asking, is the book available on Google Books? I'm pretty sure, Ben, that the book is available on Google Books. I know it's available on Amazon, and the publisher is Pesi, PESI.com. But I'm pretty sure it's available on Google Books also, and Amazon, and most online areas. So that's one. What's the difference between ego state therapy? There are outcome studies between IFS and ego state therapy. So, you know, there are no comparison studies between IFS and ego state therapy. So that I know. There's only really there's maybe 3 studies on IFS. One is with rheumatoid arthritis, interestingly enough, showing how rheumatoid arthritis got significantly better by doing IFS. The second is a complex trauma study that I was a part of, that we did, but there's no studies comparing the two. Now, ego state therapy, you know, there's certainly some overlap. Like Dick Schwartz didn't invent the concept of parts, right? We all have different aspects of our personality. Gestalt therapy, there's a lot of different modalities that will look at different ego states or parts of self. Alberto Pesso is somebody who does like role playing, what's he call it? Embodying parts and taking on those roles and working through things. So one of the differences that I would say is that IFS has this concept of self-energy, and ego state therapy is talking more about ego states or different parts, but it's not looking at the inherent wisdom or healing capacity inside, which is this thing we call self-energy. So I think that's one of the big differences. The other thing is, I don't think it has transformational healing involved in it in the way that IFS does, which is why IFS is such a great psychotherapy modality. So those would be some of the differences that I would think about. Oh, I always get this, and this is an anonymous person, right? I always get this question, Liam. How is it that you can call suicide a protection? You know, like everybody gets, that's where therapist parts get activated. What is suicide's protective, right? Because we get so triggered and activated by suicide, you know, a lot of us do. We get sued over here in the States if anybody commits suicide, like you've done something horrible and bad and wrong. So I'm aware of that, and it's very common for people to get activated around this issue of suicide. But when you start listening to the suicidal part, it serves the function of protection. I'm the only one that can stop the pain. Everybody else fails. I'm the last one. I'm the only one when it gets bad enough to fix this problem. I'm so burdened because I'm the one holding all the responsibility here. So when you start hearing what these suicidal parts are carrying, you start feeling compassionate for them. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you carry such a burden, right? And then you learn who it's protecting. Where's the pain? It's a little girl who never felt loved by her mother. It's a little boy who was sexually abused by the neighbor boys, whatever. So you start learning that the suicidal part is just desperate in trying to keep pain away. You become compassionate toward it, and you try to help it by healing the pain. And then it feels, the suicidal part feels heard, seen, and understood for the first time ever, instead of being pushed away or shut up, right? So it says, oh my gosh, this guy gets me. Finally, somebody's listening to me. So it becomes a game changer. So that's how we look at, or how we work at it. Is it possible for parts to disappear when the issue that they have created are resolved? It's a great question, Carol. No, parts do not disappear. What ends up happening is they no longer do their extreme job. Okay, parts, we all have parts in IFS's view. We all have parts, we're born with them. They can't be created nor destroyed, but they take on extreme roles in the service of protection. So a suicidal part could be a 10-year-old little boy who had to stop the pain of his mother, of him witnessing his mother getting murdered by his father, right? So the part no longer carries the job. It becomes a normal aspect of our personality. So what we do, this is one of the things I say, Liam, is we have parts retire from their job, but they still stay as a part within our system. So we don't get rid of any of them, okay? Has anyone explored the neuroscience of self-energy and the 8 C's? Well, that's great. So yes, I have been part of a science experiment. I didn't finish it because I was running the IFS Institute, which is a organization that does research, and I left the institute to kind of do some other things. But we put electrodes on my head, 22 lead electrodes, 120. Wait, how many leads were in there? 122 lead electrodes on my head. And we put 122 lead electrodes on a client. We did a therapy session together. And every time I was in self-energy, they wanted me to click a button. Self-energy, self-energy. Every time the client was in self-energy, I clicked another button. So we're really trying to look at, what does self-energy look like from the neuroscience perspective? Because we really don't know that. And this technology showed deeper brain structures, not just superficial brain activity. So those results are yet to be seen, but we don't really know what it looks like yet. But I'll be talking about my speculation based on some of the research that's out there. What percentage of time will be spent on science of PTSD? And at what point do you consider a bad experience trauma? And at what point? So, Will, I don't know what percentage, 25, 30% of the workshop will be on neuroscience. Maybe I'll say that. I kind of incorporated throughout the book. Yeah, maybe 25, 30. That'll be my best guess, Carol. I have a particular view around trauma. And interestingly enough, now that I'm moving out of the realm of psychotherapy per se, more into the general public, I really feel called to heal trauma in the world on a larger scale. I think about overwhelming life experience. People have this idea of trauma and PTSD, and it's kind of a narrow range. I believe personally that everybody has been through some form of overwhelming life experience. Okay, that's my view and my perspective. I think we're here to learn, and I think the way we learn is through overwhelming life experience. And I don't know about you, Liam, but I have not met anybody who's free of overwhelming life experiences. It doesn't exist. I don't know it. What's healthy, right? So I think everybody has overwhelming life experience. Intensity, frequency, and duration is the way I think about trauma, right? That's some of the guidelines that I look at here. And a thing that's important, Carol, that I'll say is one person can be profoundly impacted by something, and the same person sitting next to them may not have the same effect on them. So perception and impact is also variable. We see this all the time. Kids and families, same parents, being treated relatively the same way, even though the temperament's different, and they have vastly different outcomes. So everybody's different in how they're sensitive, how they absorb the trauma, how they process and deal with it. So I think there's so many variables when we're talking about that. In my opinion, I think it's all overdone. Life is just hard. Yeah, I get that. Life is hard. The good news, Carol, is we don't have to carry the crap that doesn't belong to us. That's what I'll say. But yeah, some people are very allergic to the word trauma. I don't have trauma. That's not me. And I appreciate that. That's why I switched to overwhelming life experience. Dear Frank, I'm training in compassionate inquiry at the moment and really getting into a more tender relationship with my parts. I have a long familiarity with my managers, critics, and hurt exile, but recently a joyful, loving part is showing up that feels really young. So my question is, can we exile loving child parts as well as hurt parts, or are they two sides of the same part? Well, Delphine, that's a really great question. We typically don't exile loving parts. However, loving parts will also have a hard time experiencing love or joy for some reason. So if for example, somebody yelled at you when you were feeling loving and kind, right? You have an allergic reaction to positive feelings. You have an allergic reaction to positive emotion. So it's important to kind of pay attention to where, joy isn't exiled, or happiness or love is not exiled unless there's a reason. And so what happened around the feelings of love and joy that causes this exile to happen? So you want to explore all that's surrounding it. I hope that's helpful. Matthew says, I'm happy to see that the book is on Audible. Can I ask how much I would be missing if I can't attend the webinar, but if I do read the book, apart from demos, of course? Well, it's interesting. It's a great question, Matthew. So, different people learn in different ways. And a lot of what I'm going to be teaching is going to be coming from the book. Always stuff comes up, right? So there will be new stuff that isn't mentioned in the book, and there will be a lot of stuff that's in the book. Stuff spontaneously shows up. The other thing is the practice. Like, you'll be able to do the practice and kind of learn some of it yourself. So the experiential exercises and the demos will certainly be different, and you'll be able to ask questions. So, different people learn in different ways, and I'm fine with that. All right, we have two more questions, it looks like, and then we'll come to the close here. Can IFS be used safely with family members that are suffering and willing to give it a go? Well, yeah, IFS can be used with anybody as long as they're interested and willing, like that's for sure, right? We use IFS in kids that are as young as 3 years of age, and we use IFS on people who are at the end of their lives wanting to process meaning and, meaning and purpose in their lives. So it can be used and it can be used in family settings and in group settings. Chris Burris, who's one of the lead trainers along with myself, just wrote a book on IFS and group therapy. So it can be used in group format as well as individual format. Are there parallels between IFS and psychosynthesis? I've been asked that before, and I don't know that I can really answer that. I think there's probably some overlap between psychosynthesis and IFS, but I'm not going to answer it because I don't know enough about psychosynthesis to be able to give that the energy and the intention that it needs. So I'll say sorry that I can't answer that question.
Okay, Frank, super. I really enjoyed that, and I'm really looking forward to January. So a big thanks for joining us, Frank, and especially the context of it being Thanksgiving tomorrow. So we really appreciate you taking time and such a special holiday in America. And so really, we hope that you have a really good day tomorrow, Frank. And, you know, a happy Thanksgiving to all our American friends.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And always lovely to see you. So thank you and have a great day.
Great.
First
And just
I could say.
yeah, and a big thanks to Robert and Mary who are in the background and keeping the show on the road. And as I said, we hope to see everybody on the 13th to the 15th of January. So until then, goodbye. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, bye-bye.